Visigothic Saga Publications presents Visigothic, The Barbarians of Midgard, 2nd edition, written by J.P. Newcomb. A dramatic reading of Chapter 8, read by the author, J.P. Newcomb. Chapter 8, Elisa and the Dwarf Lords. Many years in the past, there were the races of dwarves. Of those counted among the most noble of men were the dwarves of Arimel, the earthborn, humanest of all human races, crafty craftsmen and mineral miners all, the sons of Tubal, and would have been content to live in prosperous peace, and happily drink pints of ale or mine in the earth for precious ore. Alas, but both slaughter wolves and goblins chose upon the duty-bound dwarves to make vicious, woeful war. Now hear ye all the tale of King Toggerbeg Andavarson and the Dwarf Lords. Drink the mead now, valiant Visigoths, and hear how the Princess Elisa Andavar's-dottir was brought to a golden hall by the fastidious fates destined for to meet Sigmund the Volsung. News spread across Travingia of the losses suffered by the dwarves. King Osric sent word to them that they were welcome in Thorstad, and that the people of Travingia would stand by the dwarves in their hour of need. "Come, all ye dwarves, to your friends in the kingdom of Osric," was the message delivered to King Toggerbeg after the massacre of Bloody Glade. This was in spite of the fact that the dwarves had not supported them in a major way in the past, other than providing weapons to the Jarl of Frenwich. On the great day that the Aurelian dwarves arrived at Thorstad, crowds lined the procession way as the mighty King Toggerbeg Andavarson led his people amidst throngs of cheering onlookers. They rode shaggy-haired ponies and were clothed in furs, with their great beards and long hair flowing down below shoulder and chest. These men were a race of short people, the largest of whom stood no more than 5 feet and 5 inches tall. But what they lost in size, they made up for skill and courage. There were thousands and thousands of women and children as well, and the women were, for the most part, the same height as the men, with long, blue-black hair and sleek, smooth faces. Their eyes were dark as well, and the little dwarf children were absolutely adorable. The queen and her sister, as well as her ladies-in-waiting, young Aestrith and Horkild, were so taken by the dwarf children that they were smiling and giggling back and forth about them. Gerda said, "Oh, look at them, they're just so adorable." Gwendolen replied to her mother, "They're like dolls and I love them. They're so cute, I could just hug and kiss all their little faces." The vast majority of Toggerbeg's people had to camp outside the city, but a good many were able to come inside where the accommodations had been made. As long as the columns of dwarves and their families approached the main doors of the longhouse, King Toggerbeg could see the armor-clad thanes with their sharp-edged weapons and fierce-looking helmets. But he feared not an ambush, for he knew he was among friends and allies. Walking together through the doors were the monarchs of the Travingian alliance, escorted by their personal thanes, as well as the Wittenagemot, led by the lords Volsung and Snaevair. Amongst them also was little Lord Sigmund. The queen had been chosen to honor the dwarves with the official greeting. So it was that the shield maiden said, "Come, all ye dwarves, come here to us as friends and family. Welcome King Toggerbeg Andavarson to sit as an equal with the monarchs of the Travingian kingdoms. May Thor and Wotan grant protection to our cause, and we, all as one, make eunuchs of the slaughter wolves." Toggerbeg was clearly amused by the eunuch remark made by the queen, and he chuckled about it as well as did his officers and thanes. King Toggerbeg and his delegation dismounted and walked forward, warmly greeting the allied monarchs. With his delegation was Princess Elisa Andavar's-dottir, who, as I have said, was the sister of King Toggerbeg. With them as well was the dwarf high priestess Skadi and the royal thanes Dvalin and Durin, Austrian Vestries, sworn since her birth to guard Princess Elisa, were armed with swords and poleaxes. On their ornate shields were painted images of leaping dragons. Elisa stood 4 feet 9 inches and was about age 14. Her long locks of blue-black hair flowed around a tan face marked by full lips and eyes as brown as almonds. Her nose was thin, and her attire was furs and deerskin boots and chainmail armor over a forest green dress that reached to the fur cuffs of her boots. Her sword lay across her back in a sheath held to her small body by a softened rawhide belt. Elisa's eyes met that of Queen Gwendolen, who smiled a greeting back. Little Lord Sigmund set eyes upon Elisa for the first time in a fateful look out on the street in front of the mead hall as she walked by with the dwarf lords. She is so beautiful, he thought. I simply must meet her. Never before had he saw anyone so glorious and so beautiful, and Elisa and his entire body reacted with tingling collywobbles. He could not take his eyes off of her, and his heart was sailing in the clouds like the legendary skyboat. It was love at first sight, and the boy was awestruck when the dwarven princess, feeling like someone was staring at her, turned and looking at him. She couldn't help herself. She smiled back at him and fixed her eyes into his, and smiled more and more at him as collywobbles filled his entire body and his heart skipping beats because of her beauty. This was the very first time in his life that any girl had given little Lord Sigmund, age 12 and a half, such an emotional reaction, and he loved the way it made him feel. Sigmund knew that she was the most beautiful creature he had ever seen in his entire life. Unbeknownst to him, Elisa's heart was jumping as well, and her stomach was filled with collywobbles when she gazed upon Sigmund for the first time that day, and their reaction toward one another bore the mark of destiny. Oh, but he's so amazing, lad, she thought to herself, memorizing every inch of his face and stout shoulders. She was in love from that moment on, and she felt a wonderful shock of emotion in her heart for him. 'Twas the will of Freya, and she knew it. Indeed, the Aes Freya was there, invisible to everyone, but there indeed, making sure that this meeting and this attraction happened, for fate hung in the balance. The rest would be up to Sigmund and Elisa, for she could interfere no further, and so departed back into Folkvanger. The procession continued into the mead hall and entered where a fourth throne had been set up alongside of the other three for King Togerbeg. King Osric motioned with a gesture of the hand for the king of the dwarves to take his throne, and as he did, another great cheer went up from the assembled ealdormen of the Visigothic. Lord Asgar and the dwarf lords were given their places in the Visigothic, and then the Tervingian monarchs seated themselves on their thrones. Lord Snavier nodded to the ram's horn trumpet men, who in unison sounded a long call to bring to order the first meeting of the Visigothic, which was to be made up of all monarchs, both kings and their queens of all people, now in the alliance, or who would be joining the alliance against the Scythian slaughter wolves, as well as the ealdormen of their tribal Wittans. Kegs of ale were brought in for everyone to partake, as well as much food, mostly mammoth and elk meat, but as well liberal amounts of carrots and other vegetables mixed into great cauldrons of a soup called scouse. The dwarves were very hungry. Outside of the mead hall in the courtyard, there were those seeking to the needs of the thousands of dwarves and their families, as well as other refugees, and showing them to the comfortable quarters in the city of Thorstad. Work had already started on the building of a quarter for the dwarves north of the city to be called Dwarudorf, and the walls were being extended around it at a furious pace. Food was being taken to the thousands of dwarves camped outside the log and earthen walls of the city. Mammoth hunting had been good this year, and no one was starving. Soon a city of dwarves arose outside of Thorstad, which would have to be enclosed by a wall as strong as the current one, and it was called Dwarudorf. Little Lord Sigmund sat next to his sister Greta at a long table eating his scouse. He could not stop from looking across the aisle at Elisa, who was sitting next to her mother, Rutia, the dowager queen of the dwarves. Her thanes, Austria, and Vestri were there to guard this dour woman who had given birth to Elisa quite late in life, but even more importantly was the oath that they'd sworn to King Andavar on his deathbed. Mortally wounded by goblins, that they would guard Elisa and keep her safe for the rest of their lives. As for Rutia, she was silver-haired and dignified, but when she smiled, her teeth were green. Sigmund shuddered at the thought of what her breath must smell like. Elisa looked back at Sigmund and smiled. The boy blushed red and quickly looked back to his soup. His brother, Lord Gedrun, who sat with King Sigurd's delegation, noticed the glances between his little brother and the dwarf princess and smiled. But he said not a word, keeping it all in his thoughts. A blast from the horns brought everyone in the mead hall to silence, and everyone stood up as the monarchs took their thrones. Lord Volsung made the announcement saying, Hear ye, all nobles and delegates of the Turingian Alliance in the Kingdom of the Dwarves. Let this first Lieutenant Gemot of our new Step Confederation come to order. When the monarchs were seated, Volsung gave a hand signal and everyone sat back down, and Volsung declared, King Sigurd will now speak, my brothers and sisters. The king looked from left to right as the assembly grew quiet. Not even the slurping of beer could be heard. He stood up and said, It is good for all of us to be here this day, brothers. This Witten heralds the beginning of a new hope for all of our peoples and marks the beginning of the end for the slaughter wolves and their evil reign of terror. But this we know, no matter the cost, no matter what we lose in the short term, victory shall be ours and freedom will reign once more. I have momentous news to share with everyone. This is news of great importance and great joy and happiness. King Sigurd turned to his left and said, Rise, Queen Gwendolen Brunhilda, Volsung's Dottir, my beloved wife, matriarch of the Celtic tribe, shield maiden of Turvingia, and ruler of my heart. The queen rose from her throne and joined her husband at his side, standing with him in front of the great assembly of the people. She looked beautiful beyond description as her long locks of dark red raven hair fell down her back in her favorite style of interlocking ponytails. Thick double cords starting on either side of her head above her small ears, but coming around her head to join in one great cord at her shoulder line, falling down to her waist. Her beauty was a natural beauty, and not the painted-on kind, such as are the women of Troy and Hellas far to the south. She held her head and chin up high as a proud queen, yet one could see that her pride was not one of arrogance. On her head sat the jeweled crown of the Getic queen. Her husband took his beloved wife by the hand, saying to all the assembly, It has come to pass that the Getic kingdom shall be blessed with an heir. The Lord of Asgard has blessed Queen Gwendolen, and she is with child. Long live the queen! Long live the child! The entire assembly roared in applause and great cheering. King Osric rose from his throne, as did King Togerbeg, and joined in the chorus as well. Long live the queen! Long live the child! Long live the queen! Long live the child! The queen's family was overjoyed at the news, but the queen's mom and sister had to act surprised because Gwen had already confided in them a week ago. Gedrun and Sigmund were really as happy as was their father, the great warlord Volsung. Gedrun pulled Sigmund up on his shoulders and said, Uncle Siggy. The boy hugged his brother around the neck and kissed him on the head, for he loved him dearly, and replied, Uncle Gedry. There was singing and dancing in the main audience chamber, and a welcome bit of happiness in a gloomy time of war. Bayok saw it all through the eyes of his butterfly from his monastery of Yerpa in faraway Shangri-La, just as he had done when the queen had first announced that they had conceived. But someone else was watching, and Bayok noticed that a small young Hugin was perched up in the rafters. So, Hister knows of this as well. He will try and prevent the birth of the child, just as he has tried to prevent his conception. The time has come for me to take my journey west. They have sent Sir Horsa and his knights to fetch me to Turingian kingdoms, and so we shall go. The time of the gathering draws near, Mincy, as you well know. Have we not seen it in the stars? Bayok spoke these words to his wife, the spirit maiden of the east, Mincy. He may have been a great wizard and a prophet, but this did not require him to walk alone in life, and she was his greatest friend this side of Asgard. Then I shall make ready our journey, husband. I remember the prophecy as well. Is it not written in the sacred scrolls, saying, Now a great sign was seen in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, under her feet the moon, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and about to give birth, and she screamed in the agony of labor. Another sign was seen in heaven. There was a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and on its heads were 7 royal crowns. Its tail swept a third of the stars out of heaven and threw them down to the earth. It stood in front of the woman about to give birth, so that it might devour the child the moment it was born. She gave birth to a son, a male child, the one who will rule all the nations with a staff of iron. Lady Minsay of Cathay was dressed in long silk robes embroidered with lotus flowers. Her hair was thick and straight, long and black, tied into a ponytail. She gathered up the teacups on a tray, rose from the small table, and carried them away. Her father was a war master of the Rising Sun and had trained her in all the fighting arts. Kung Fu would serve her well. "I will prepare things for our journey, husband," she said as she left the room. Bayak's butterfly fluttered its wings and flew from the rafter above the thrones and was immediately spotted by Hister's raven. The foul bird took flight and dove down in an attempt to eat Bayak's butterfly. But as it drew in close, a tiny bolt of lightning jumped from the tail of the butterfly, striking the bird in the eye. The Hugin was blinded and went out of control. It crashed head-on into another roof beam, fell straight down, landing in Elisa's soup. She was aghast. Sigmund leaped over the table and charged across the aisle. The bird regained its composure and jumped out of the soup bowl just as Sigmund grabbed it. It squawked and beat its wings into the boy's face as Elisa grabbed it with him. The two of them slammed the bird down onto the table as the people around were roaring in laughter. At that point, Rutia began shouting in anger at the whole situation, stomping her feet, saying, "This is supposed to be a maid hall, not an aviary." Sigmund drew his dagger and impaled the bird, pinning it to the table. "Did you have to do that to me supper, boy?" shouted Rutia. All the dwarves at the table, especially Austrian vestry, were beside themselves with laughter. Elisa looked at Sigmund and her heart skipped a beat, and with a bright smile she said calmly, You saved me, me handsome prince. I've finally found a hero." Sigmund, smiling back, replied with wonder and amazement in his voice, so smitten by her was he, saying, "All well and good, my lady," and returned her smile as his own heart skipped a beat as collywobbles filled his innards. He bowed in respect, saying, "I'm Sigmund the Volsung, at your service." She smiled big and wide and replied shyly, "I'm Elisa, princess of the dwarves. Nice to meet you, Siggy." Seeing as Princess Elisa had wasted no time in giving him a nickname, he replied, "You too, Lisa." He couldn't help but stutter, and his heart were pounding in his chest, and he did not understand why, because no girl had ever caused him to feel this way. He just didn't know what to think. But it was so new for him, that much he knew for sure. She had the same reaction towards him, and Elisa was able to conceal it only slightly better than Sigmund. Rutia could see this going on and was angered by it. She glared at her daughter and Sigmund both. Austri fetched the dead Hugin and took it outside and tossed it into the street, whereupon a cat seized it and took it away for dinner. Far to the west in Koloba, Hister was not amused.
"So, Bayak strikes directly at me. Soon he will know the power of the dark side when we shall soon face off with these so-called Guardians of Midgard, and they are all doomed."
He laughed as if he were a maniac. Meanwhile, in a field far away, Dragos and his gargoyles took flight on the return trip to Koloba, leaving behind a field of horror. Hundreds of crucified Cimmerians on trees and crosses. These were the very ones who had attacked the dwarves, bringing them into the war on the side of the rebellion, but they dare not attack Commandant Grimgor, for another great army of goblins were marching north from their underground kingdom in the great lofty mountains led by Field Marshal Zorkon and Commandant Vlach. Zuki, king of the goblins, known far and wide as the great goblin, would not soon join the battle in person. He was a sly creature who would play both sides. If the rebellious humans were crushed, he would partake of the spoils and slaves. On the other hand, if the humans of King Adonthursus were overthrown, then he could switch sides and partake of that plunder. Allied with the goblins were many trolls, and he hoped the Minotaurs of King Taurus IX, but at that point, such a deal was far from certain. Far away, toward the land of the rising sun, traveling steadily east toward Shangri-La, were Sir Horsa and his knights on the quest to secure the aid of the White Wizard of the East, and they'd been traveling for many days, crossing rivers and plains, going south of the Stone Belt Fells. They made for the river Oxus in the country of Bactria. The route from there would carry them across the great deserts and then high into Baltistan, and thence to the kingdom at the top of the world, that land of legend known as Shangri-La. Once there, they must find the monastery of Yerpa and persuade the Holy Guardian to come to their aid. Or so they thought, for Bayek and Minci were already in action as well as the rest of the Guardians. But all was not going as planned. One afternoon, as the 12 knights watered their horses at a small stream, the ground trembled ever so slightly. The stream at this point was backed up into a pond, and a slight ripple went through the calm water. Suddenly the horses raised their heads from drinking. Their ears stood straight up, and they became very worried and nervous. The ripple went through the water. The horse and the knights stood up and began looking around to see what caused this. They could feel tension in the air, and something was not right. Again, the water rippled, and they felt the ground vibrate slightly once more beneath their feet. So horses said, "Mount up, mates, this is not good. I feel we be stuck with dragons. Hurry now, lads." No sooner had the knights regained their seats on the horses than they heard a great bellowing roar and the snort from the nostrils of a great reptile running at them. "Make for the rocks!" shouted Sir Horsa. "We cannot outrun it. We'll have to fight it off or be eaten alive with our horses." The great dragon stood on its hind legs. It was about 12 feet tall. It had a long tail and small claw-like arms. Its head was oval-shaped, a long, rounded snout. It had nostrils at the end of the snout over the top of a huge mouth full of razor-like teeth. It leaped forward with a wide-open mouth, nearly catching Sir Anton and his horse both. The knights urged their horses onward, for this great lizard was after them for breakfast. Up ahead was a large group of boulders with room enough for the horses to get in between. They raced forward with the dragon in hot pursuit. Dust flew into the air, and as the lizard gave a mighty roar, leaped as hard as it could forward with a wide-open mouth. Horses spun around with his crossbow and fired an arrow which embedded itself in the dragon's tongue. The beast screeched in pain and crashed onto the ground sideways. The knights were able to make it into the rocks just in the nick of time, into a cranny where the dragon was too large to follow. The beast jumped up and then began clawing at the arrow with his arms. Then, seeing men going between the rocks, it roared at them. When it did, a great jet of liquid fire spewed forth from its mouth, burning up the arrow and singeing Sir Kraus and Sir Anton, who were bringing up the rear. After that, it snorted and ran the other direction, still trying to get the arrowhead out of its tongue. Suddenly, all the knights were laughing. "Oh, blimey, we're lucky today, lads. That thing was a young pup. Had that been the mum, we'd be dead," said Sir Anton. Sir Horsa replied, "The pup hasn't much experience on the hunt, so if he's going to survive, he'd better get it together. We'll have to be extra cautious, knowing that there'd be dragons here. Who knows where the mum is, so we better get up sticks. Hurry, lads, on the double." Sir Kraus replied, "Too bad we cannot tame that thing. Be easy to stop a campfire." The men broke into hearty laughter, and Sir Anton slapped Kraus on the shoulder, saying, "Only then would your cooking be fit to eat, mate." The laughter erupted as they exited the boulders. The knights continued to the southeast with no more trouble from the beast. For hundreds of leagues lay ahead of them. Farther to the west, the Scythians and their allies were steadily consolidating their forces. The plan was that Korgontal's army would march from Scythia Gelonus, backed by Gorkon Mar and his ogres, and destroy the rebellious Turingians who had not yet been able to make it to safety in Thorstadt. They would seek revenge for all the imperial overseers that had been killed in the uprising. In fact, all of them had been, and the first of these was to be the unfortunate Visigothic, led by King Tane, who nailed the Scythian overseer in Taneguard upside down to the city wall before retreating north to join King Osric. These people were gathering slowly from the steppes, coming together high on the river plains of Tanis. Tane's people were armed only with an assortment of bronze weapons, very few which were true swords, and most were armed with farm implements, and fewer yet even had armor. What weapons of steel they had been taken from the Scythian garrison, whom they'd burned alive in their barracks, killing those who fled to the inferno with arrows. Oh, what sad misfortune! After 7 days, the slaughter was fell on the Visigothic and destroyed them in an act of terrible vengeance. King Tane's people, being so ill-armed, were no match for the three-pronged attack launched by Korgontal and Gorkon Mar. Those who escaped were few, but those that did made their way northeast towards Thorstadt, hoping to find Jarl Godwin along the way. King Tane was killed along with the entire royal family, and word of this disaster came in from Godwin the very day after the announcement of the queen's pregnancy. And back in Dacia, Hister's laughter echoed through the dark chambers of Kol Oba as he watched, via the eyes of another Hugin, and the waters of his siring chalice, saying with menacing sarcasm,
Where are your petty rebels now, Bayok?
Still more horror and sadness for the next tribe to fall victim to the vicious assaults of King Adonthursus were the poor Visigothic, who lived down on the coast of the Great Dark Sea near the mouth of the river Tanis, not far from a Hellian trade settlement, a small but rich city called Pallas. They were armed much the same as their Visigothic brethren. A few men had bronze swords and spears, as well as bows and arrows, leather shields, as well as a few wooden ones. Adonthurus' large army, among who were the fierce Amazon shield maidens known as the Order of the Serpent Maidens, had been reinforced by a regiment of ogres mounted on black razor-backed betusked boars, and by units of goblin stormtroopers sent up to join the alliance ahead of the main goblin army. The tyrant led a force of 25,000 Scythians, Sarmatians, and Chimerians, along with ogres, gargoyles, goblins, and trolls. The Scythians were armed with weapons of hardened steel, but many of their allies were armed with bronze. On this wailful day, King Agnar gave a heroic fight but was overwhelmed from three sides. He fought a rearguard action as they abandoned their fortress of Lagengard, out of which allowed 25% of the women and children to escape. The Serpent Maidens were the first to find the remains of the Scythian overseer who'd been made a blood eagle by King Agnar. The overseer had been tied face down, his back split open, his rib bones chopped off the spine with an axe, and his lungs pulled out, wings as it were, in vengeance for the rapes of many women in Lagengard. Those who were captured by the Amazons were tied in a rope chain and marched as thralls to Kol Oba to work on Hystra's mammoth-sized building project. Agnar escaped east and north with a scant 1,100 men and 4,000 women and children out of what had been a tribe of 20,000 people. Neither would the Isedones of King Grunwald make it intact to the rendezvous. Their fate was as that of King Agnar, to whom they had been on their way to join forces. King Agnar's face was grim as he and the survivors beheld the smoking ruins of what had once been a happy camp of joyful, freedom-loving Gomarians. He removed his great horned helmet, and his long blonde hair was blown by the wind. Smoke burned his eyes, and he wiped away the tears lest he be seen as weak by those refugees who now depended upon his leadership to make it to the rendezvous. "Sire, we have found the bodies of King Grunwald and Queen Gertrude," said a knight who had been searching the ruins of Grunwald Hall, meaning the House of the Green Forest, with the troops. "Then my sister is indeed gone to Valhalla." "Indeed gone to Valhalla!" shouted Agnar in anger. "I suppose I should be joyous for her to go, dying a death of a shield maiden and entering Valhalla, but yea, I'm sad." Seeing a Hugin in the air, he looked at it, saying, "I say to you, Hista, that there are survivors in all massacres, and this shall be your doom. I say to hell with you and Loki!" From out of this disaster, King Agnar led the tattered remains of the Visigothic and the few who remained of the Isedones north and east of Thorstadt, where he took his place in the mead hall with the other monarchs. Among the Visigothic refugees was a tiny little orphan girl named Lilia, whose family had been slaughtered by the ogres as they fled Grunwald. She was alone, with nothing but a torn dress on her tiny body and a ragged little doll. She wandered in a daze around the area of the mead hall, lost and all alone. The people fed her, but she stayed with no one, rejecting even the company of the other orphans. She was so afraid, being terribly separated from her parents and big brother, feeling so forlorn and abandoned in a world of strange and scary faces. Her blonde hair was tangled, and her beautiful little face was covered with dirt and grime. Meanwhile, not too far away from the child in the street, in the comfort of the mead hall sat the queen. Upon hearing the news of the death of her friend Queen Gertrude, Gawain was distraught and vowed revenge for this senseless massacre. So far, the war was not going well for the freedom fighters. The people of Travingia could not understand why the Scythians and their allies wanted to dominate all this great land when there was plenty of room for all species and all races to live in peace together. Was it not a fact that the great glaciers were melting more and more each year? Was not all Midgard warming and giving everyone so much more room and so many more types of plants to find and to cultivate? There was meat for all, herds of deer, elk, bison, musk oxen, mastodons, and mammoths. So much ice was melting till even the great dragons were beginning to spread out so far that they were not so much a menace as they had once been, but it seemed as though even the more Earth changed for the better now, 7 years short of 6 centuries after the great flood, that the hearts of men had not changed. Greed and lust for power continued, even affecting these faraway but great lands of Midgard, north of the great dark sea and the great lofty mountains. But now I must digress a century in order to tell the tall, towering tale of a wizard and a spirit maiden, guardians of Midgard.